My name is Chris. I'm an engineering manager at Twitter. I'm responsible for their open source program. So essentially what that means is, I kind of have the fun job of deciding what we actually, open source and give to the community, which is fun. But I also kind of have the bad job of kind of dealing with lawyers and any legal issues that come up in open source land because, it happens occasionally. Before I kind of get into the meat of the talk about kind of, how we approach open source at Twitter, it's always important to kind of have a little context and history of kind of where we came from. So, back in 2006, it was a stupid little idea of like, hey, I have status updates. I want to share it, with my friends and, and people, interesting to me. Obviously that stupid idea, gained a lot of traction. So some of you remember in 2008, the service had some growing pains. We were down back in 2009, we finally had a lot of crazy growth. So, we were inciting revolutions. People were tweeting about beer and bacon and all sorts of things. So the tweet count definitely started to go up. In 2010, we started to raise a good amount of money, and it was like, all right, shit, this service is actually really important. We need to actually build a real company here. So we kind of, got on that. And if you kind of look at the employee growth history, back in kind of mid 09, we're talking 20, 30 people, and we're essentially at least doubling every year. If we look at kind of Twitter today, I didn't log in and check, but we're over 1,400 employees worldwide. Where a big part of Twitter is we're very engineering-driven company, so Twitter will always be at least 50% engineers. Some people may ask so why do you need 700 plus people to run a simple service? But anytime you get to a certain size and you have to scale, there's nothing kind of off the shelf you could buy to deal with those problems. So we have dedicated teams that do caching and storage and all that stuff. So we're growing like crazy, and kind of where I came in is the engineers kind of, ran and still run kind of the asylum at Twitter. We were open sourcing things, almost since the beginning of the company, but we had, some issues, right? People were kind of just chucking code, on GitHub, which is cool, right? But as part of that, we were doing some naughty things we're leaking some keys and credentials and other embarrassing things, which sucks, right? But which I don't feel that bad anymore because GitHub recently enabled search across all the repos, and then this tweet from Zeph was let's commit our private SSH keys to GitHub. So I'm all right, other people made the same mistake. I don't feel that bad. So so we made some mistakes, and I was kind of brought in to help with the problem. We're getting sent, if you become a certain size, you become kind of a legal target. People were sending us wonderful cease and desist letters and all that good stuff. So, they basically tasked me with, Chris, you own this problem now. Craft our, and create our open source program from scratch and do it right. You kind of have the ability to do so. So, in order to do that, we kind of had to establish some operating principles as a company of how we kind of go about things. So I kind of will go through those now, and hopefully you kind of have an idea of kind of how we act. So always since the beginning, Twitter has always used open source software, kind of by default. Anytime we start a product, we generally try to use or find something out there to kind of consume. And, before we go reinventing the wheel, we make damn sure that we're not going to write another key value store and then try to at least benchmark with the available solutions out there. And basically as a result of this, the whole Twitter stack is mostly open source. There's very little commercial-related software in our stack. There's some, but it's mostly all open source software. So another thing that we kind of do is inside the company, as part of our training, we kind of define our secret sauce as a company. What it means. What is our business value? And so once you kind of define this, it's kind of easy to decide what you want to open source. And so for part of Twitter, we're a data company, right? Data is sacred to us. We're building an ads platform, so the technology around that is sacred, and maybe some technology around kind of how we scale certain technologies is kind of secret. But everything else is essentially fair game, and so we kind of, once you kind of know what your secret sauce is, everything else is fair game to kind of open source, and we kind of subscribe to that philosophy. I remember when I kind of first joined Twitter, there was like this little CSS toolkit called like Blueprint that they wanted to open source, and as soon as you kind of have your secret sauce defined, it's an easy decision to say, hey, let's open source this. This eventually became Bootstrap, and a year later, it's like the most popular project on GitHub. But when we were first about to open source it, I was like, oh, just a crappy little CSS toolkit. I guess I was wrong. So it happens. So, yeah. I'm a JVM dude, not a front end guy. So another thing we do within the company, we basically assume anything that we develop that's not related to our secret sauce will be eventually open. And so so we essentially pretend the whole world will be watching. We try to be really strict about our dependencies. We're very careful about choosing project names because sometimes when you go open source things, you're like, shit, someone is using that name, and the lawyers are angry at me, so I have to change it. So we basically take care of all of this since the beginning and assume that software will eventually be opened. The other principle we kind of operate by is we default to GitHub when it comes to publishing and developing open source software. If you're not aware, GitHub is huge these days. It's unbelievable how fast it's growing. They provide great tools, a great service. We love pull requests. Works out really great for us. A special note about open source foundations, given that there's like some folks in the crowd there. We love them, but we tend to prefer not to start our projects there. We prefer to kind of build a community and gain traction as fast as possible before moving to a place like Apache or something. Here's my kind of like screw the GPL slide. So we generally default to permissive licenses. We're huge fans of Apache, MIT, and BSD. So in this case, it's just easier for both us and any adopters out there when they consume the software. If it's under a very liberal and permissive license, you don't really need that much permission to use it. You just maybe need to do some attribution and you're good to go. So we generally prefer to be permissive around our open source software. And if you kind of look at the trend, not to go on like a little tangent, but like it's hard to name any recent kind of open source foundation or major project that is not under kind of a permissive license. And I'm thinking like OpenStack, OpenCommute. I think it's definitely the trend out there. And if you guys are familiar with Antirez, he's like main author of Redis. He kind of went on this like open source rant a few days ago, which I think is kind of indicative of the kind of the trend the industry is going. He was like, I don't really care what people do with my code. As long as they, I don't really care if they release modifications back. I just simply want people to use my code one way, or another. And he goes kind of on and on. And it's like, for me, other people making money out of something I wrote is not something I lost. It's something, I gained. And he kind of goes on saying that, here are my reasons. Like, I'm having a bigger effect in the world if somebody's using my code to pay the bills. Awesome. If there's tons of people making money off of my code, maybe they'll share some of that and hire me. And or I could be one of the guys making the money myself. And so this is kind of like this is his kind of reasoning of why he chooses a permissive license in this case, BSD. And I think this is just like an indicative trend where things are kind of going in industry. So another kind of little special thing we do within Twitter is so there's kind of been a trend in, at least, I don't know, the Bay Area, lots of talent-related acquisitions. So we acquire very small companies, mostly for just people, because it's impossible to hire engineers these days. So as part of our kind of M&A discussions, we actually include open sourcing, any potential code that we acquire along with the people, because if you just want the people, like, let's try to do at least something with the code. And we've done it a couple times. Like one time we acquired a small security firm, Whisper Systems. They basically created Android apps for like encrypting text messages and phone calls, and we're like, well, we're not going to really use this, so let's just give it back. And a nice little community has flourished over GitHub, which is quite nice. Another recent case was we acquired a couple guys that wrote like a mobile A/B testing framework, Clutch.io. We didn't really want to use it. We said we're going to shut down the service. A few months later, some of their competitors actually took the code and like offered automatic migration tools for existing customers to go there. Like, great, everyone wins. Like, we got people, and the old customers are happy because they kind of migrated off. So I'm kind of proud that Twitter operates kind of that way. In terms of measuring things, so like one thing in this conference that I learned is lots of people like to measure a lot of things, and so same goes with Twitter. We have a ginormous internal dashboard called BirdBrain on the inside, and pretty much any employee could kind of get an idea of what is going on. I could like say how many, I could easily see how many people tweeted today within, in London, or like how many open source commits did we have, the last week. So it's all available, and we pretty much measure everything that we do in open source land. And the other important kind of last principle is we kind of have a notion of paying it forward. So, we're very fortunate, as a company, and we've used a ton of open source software, and we wouldn't kind of be where we are without having that. And so we have an initiative to actually go and support organizations that are important to us, like Apache and other folks out there. So it's kind of ingrained in our culture to at least give back a little bit for what we've gained. And, that's kind of like sums up kind of our principles and craft around open source. And as an added bonus, this stuff actually kind of fits in a tweet, which is good. So I was kind of excited when that worked out. You take your screenshot. So I think it's 128 characters, I hope. If not, I'm lying. Let's talk a little bit kind of how we kind of scale things out, because like we're growing like crazy. We're 1,400 plus people. So how do we handle open sourcing projects? So we're a Jira shop internally. We unfortunately or fortunately work with Jira. We kind of took some inspiration. I have quite a history at the Eclipse Foundation. I kind of dig the way they kind of do their IP tracking, and kind of was inspired by that, and we essentially used Jira to track all of our open source project and initiate discussions around whether we should open this or not. Some people may be like, guys, this is process, this sucks, but I think it was Clay Shirky that said, like, process is an embedded reaction to prior stupidity, which I think is somewhat true, but I don't think it's all bad. I think, if you kind of recall the history of surgery, right? It was crazy. People were doing all crazy shit back in the day, bloodletting, and eventually they figured it out. There was this guy, Ignis, he was like, well, I notice if I, wash my hands and then I do surgery, there's less infection, right? Good things. So eventually those were codified into like checklists, and so I'm glad, I'm sure you guys are glad if you go to like surgery, there's surgeons that have a checklist and go through it, and there's a process. So not all processes are bad, in my opinion. So in terms of quality, as part of this whole process, we automate kind of our baseline quality, what it means to be like a good open source project. And so we just write a simple little tool that goes and groks the repo and essentially checks for like a README, a license. Do you have contributing guidelines? Because people want to find a way to contribute to a project. Do you have a way to build your project using a CI system? In this case, we prefer Travis CI a lot. It's kind of the new hot thing for CI these days. We also check to make sure we're not leaking any keys or sensitive IPs like the good old days, and just generally avoiding GPL related, viral related licensing to make things simple. So this actually works out pretty well for us. It kind of enforces and teaches kind of good practices for engineers who want to go open source things within Twitter. Another kind of interesting thing we do is like it's a bit of a bitch to find engineers these days. So we've grown quite quickly, and one thing we do, given that we measure pretty much everything, so it's pretty easy for us to run queries on all of our open source projects and projects that are interesting to us, like say maybe Hadoop or whatever. And basically, given that we know our employees and here are the list of contributions, we could quickly figure out who are not employees and then kind of feed recruiting a little bit. So it's something we do to kind of help with hiring these days. So it's kind of fun. I mean, it's kind of a little shady, but whatever. It's hard to find people. People appreciate the attention, I think. Another thing that we kind of do to kind of get an idea of what's going on within open source land within Twitter is we kind of send out weekly reports on what did we open source this week, who are like the top committers based on kind of some metric, here are the releases, any contentious issues, which are kind of like simple algorithms issues with the most comments. So basically just getting an idea of what is going on a weekly basis, and also kind of also kind of motivates engineers to actually, it's like, hey, I want to be top committer this week, so people actually push pretty hard to kind of have fun with that. So that's kind of a little thing we do to get an idea of what's going on within the company. And kind of to like wrap things up is, if you kind of define your principles and get a set of guidelines that everyone knows within the company, it's pretty easy to kind of make the decision of like, all right, we know our secret sauce, the rest of the stuff could be open to the public and we're all good. Another thing that I think is a common theme within monkey gras, for some other companies like Etsy, measuring everything is extremely important, because if you don't measure it, how can you make reasonable decisions? And the final thing is around automation. So yes, if you get to a certain size, like Twitter, there is going to be some process. There are going to be some managers. The best thing you could do that is to pretty much automate as much as that process as you can. And then other than that, I mean, thanks to you guys for listening. Especially for those who survived last night's beer fest. So it's been a little rough this morning, but thank you again for taking the time to listen.
Okay.